record. Yes, all
Perfect.
good.
Excellent.
But
Excellent.
by the way, Teach, how bad is the user experience and the user interface of Zoom? Honestly.
Actually, compared to everything else, it's better.
Okay. Context.
So actually, you know, to be absolutely honest about it, I've used quite a bit of Microsoft Teams because other parts of WPP mandate the use of Teams, and I have to say it's partly better simply because it's the one you're most familiar with. So there's always that effect, which is that in its defense, I'd say that it's very interesting because it's pretty good if you're a frequent user, but if you're an infrequent user, I agree with you. It's fairly flawed. And I always think, you know, and I suppose in a way, they've been quite clever because the meeting host, who's more likely to be a frequent user, has a more complex interface than the guest does. Which probably makes sense. And actually, in fairness to them, in many respects, in the early days, what you might call the non-expert user experience of Zoom was a hell of a lot better than anybody else. You could just click on a link and you were in the meeting, for example.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, the really appalling user experience is things like email is atrocious. Calendaring is very, very bad. You know, and actually other examples of cases, you know, there are a lot of things which I think are a disaster in technology because they're good enough to prevent anybody competing, but they're not good enough to change the world. And a classic example of that kind of technological Mexican standoff, I think happens with things like Bluetooth. Bluetooth isn't really good enough, is it? No. Right? Yeah. There should have been a much, much better way to make Bluetooth work. And for some reason, okay, you know, Bluetooth was developed a bit too early. It became ubiquitous. Every device has Bluetooth. It would take you, you know, it would take you decades to try and knock Bluetooth off its perch. I mean, it's interesting that one of the biggest things that Spotify does of value to me is the ability, without leaving the app, to change the speaker, okay? Now, what's interesting about that is nobody else does this. This really fascinates me. So why doesn't say, well, Audible doesn't let me do that. Okay. I can't just go, okay, Audible, I want you to play this now through my hi-fi behind me, which is sort of that orange thing. You can just see the edge of it there, rather than playing it through my headphones. And to do that, I have to leave, go into Bluetooth, connect, wait. Okay. And other technologies, I think there's a whole list of technologies which are, and I call it maximally non-viable product, which is it's good enough to occupy and basically, you know, and you probably see this in evolution, to be absolutely honest. You know, things that basically, you know, nothing else can compete because there's this dominant force. And it leads to a kind of evolutionary dead end.
That reminds me of Moore's work on crossing the chasm, where, you know, you have something that has crossed the chasm, and because the adoption is so large, that the first new entrants in the market have difficulty catching up, even though they might be better. I wonder, does the same logic apply to Betamax versus VHR as well?
Yeah, undoubtedly what happened with VHS, I've got it already, strangely. What happened with VHS, apparently, a bit of it was porn, okay, which is you could get porn on VHS, but you couldn't get porn on Betamax.
Wow.
And no, of course, nobody ever spoke about that as being one of the big influences that gave VHS dominance. But then you had what's called a network effect, where essentially, you know, if you went to your local video rental store for actually recording your own programs, Betamax was better than VHS, and a Philips format called Video 2000, I think, was actually better than Betamax. Right?
Wow.
But unfortunately, Sony made Betamax exclusive to Sony devices. Philips made Video 2000 exclusive to Philips devices. And there was a range of competing manufacturers in the VHS space. And so VHS then started off with kind of 55% of the market, or 60%, because Sony was a very powerful brand back then, not quite so much Philips. Okay.
Yeah.
And then what happened is once you had 60%, it meant that at your video rental store, 80% of the titles were in VHS and only 20% were in Betamax. And so it was a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop between video rental stores, porn, okay, which nobody talked about, okay, because nobody ever said, you know, nobody in market research ever said, I would actually get Betamax for its superior recording possibilities, but when it comes to filth, you know, it's a non-starter.
Hoochie Mama 42.
Exactly, you know, my hentai connection doesn't play on, you know, right? Okay.
Nonsense. That's your nonsense.
Nonsense. Concept. Exactly. Yeah. So it then basically meant that Philips went to 1% of the market. Sony went to 10. There's an anomaly, by the way, interestingly, which is for a long time. Obviously, this is irrelevant now. For about 15, 20 years, Betamax was the dominant format in Latin America. And it must have just been some geographical accident where in Latin America, Sony had a really successful sales drive, so it went the other way. I mean, really interesting to trace the origins of that. But it's also important. Douglas McWilliams makes the point that one of the great breaks on technological progress, and one of the most interesting things, is the penetration of the domestic telephone in the United States. I think it took from 1890 or 1888, okay, when Bell was founded, to about 1950 before the telephone reached 50% of American households. And the problem was that there were too many people who didn't know anybody else with a phone. And I said the same thing about mobile phones. If mobile phones hadn't allowed you to call landlines, okay, it would have taken an extra 10 years for them to take off. Because in the early stages, I remember where I had a very early mobile phone and I borrowed mobile phones from the company, because in the very early days, the company had this kind of pool of 8 mobiles. And if you had to go on a business trip, you'd sign one out for the day, you see. And what was really interesting there, and this really was interesting, okay, is that what really fascinates me is that in the early days, a mobile to mobile call was a real rarity. So you called your colleagues back at their desk, you see, from the mobile. And if you ever made a mobile to mobile call, that was like the first 4 minutes of the call was spent going, are you on your mobile? I'm on my mobile too. I'm on a boat, you know. And the whole conversation was about the fact that both of you were out of doors. And this was unbelievably fucking amazing. And so it's this network effect is really interesting. So is I think that video conferencing was set back by 10 years. I mean, the pandemic overcame this problem, okay? But I think video calling was set back about 5 or 6 years by the fact that Skype, Google, you know, Google Duo, Google Meet, Facebook, WhatsApp, okay, Skype, they were all right, but they weren't good enough to make a difference.
Yeah.
And so they were big enough to keep other people out of the market. They also made a fundamental mistake, by the way. I also think things like GoToMeeting were just a bit too unwieldy, right? Or you know, right? Or WebEx, right?
Yeah.
But I think the fundamental mistake was that they also all adopted the phone call model where I ring you, right? Now, for my kids, that's acceptable behavior. You know, my kids might video call one of their friends, or they might video call their grandparents, right?
Yeah.
In a business setting, it's a total no-no, right? If I'm in a total panic and I'm having, a massive debate, and therefore I'm 2 minutes late for the meeting because I'm involved in some meeting, and you ring me and go, hi, right? It's a total social gaffe.
Yeah.
And so the whole Skype format was totally inappropriate. And then there are a load of other things, which is that another one was perceptual. It was simply a perceptual problem. Now, let me explain this, okay? First of all, most video meetings took place in the early days as an alternative to a physical meeting. In other words, the physical meeting was possible and you decided to hold it over video. And that way, it wasn't quite as good as a physical meeting. And what people noticed was this is like a physical meeting, but it's not as good. Okay. What's happened now is people realize, well, I always say when people go, it's not as good as meeting face to face, I say, yeah, it's not as good as meeting face to face. Obviously, like a phone call isn't as good as like sex, right?
Yeah.
Okay, right. Okay, yeah. We know that. What the point is the opportunity cost, which is there are now hundreds of meetings taking place, which would never have happened at all had we not done video. Because I mean, just meeting
context
now,
frame is way off.
So this meeting now would have involved, 6 weeks to organize, and it would have cost 300 quid in flight costs, right? So, realistically, it was probably not going to happen for a year and a half. You'd have to wait until there were 4 other things taking you to London. I'd have to wait until I got a paid speaking event in Holland. Then I get a paid speaking event in Holland, but it was at 5 o'clock and I'd missed the last flight back. So so we'd only get to meet for 10 minutes. And so it's always worth remembering a cost is always more visible than an opportunity cost.
I love that. I love that. I love that. But it's so hard to argue against because one is tangible and the other isn't. The other feels loose, hypothetical. It's the case that you make in alchemy. You make this case early in the book, I believe maybe chapter 1 or something. You talk about in advertising how cute animals, for example, can have a higher effectiveness than something which is logical. But it's super hard to present such an idea to a board. Or your airplane example. We should talk about cucumbers versus like our new fancy airplanes, and they're like, Rory, I don't know what you're smoking, but like, give me a little bit of that.
The marketing guy in BA, a very good guy, marketing and customer experience guy, was Dutch. Yeah. And every time he'd come up with these things, people, being Dutch, you're stereotyped as a pot smoker, you see. Right? So everybody would go, Herman, what have you been smoking? They say, right? Okay. And he said, I get that like twice a day, and being highly creative and Dutch is a double jeopardy because not only does nobody understand what you're saying, but they assume you're under the influence of drugs. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Okay, let me ask you a question, because I not only have I seen all of your work, I've studied everything you've ever put out extensively, so I can memorize it forwards, backwards, and whatever. There is one thing that I wanted to ask you that I've never seen you talk about, or have someone seen ask you, which is, you talk about technological economic value creation and psychological economic value creation, right?
And the Austrians are right about this all along. It's in the head.
Yeah.
If the person doesn't want to buy it, you haven't got a product, right?
Exactly. So here's my question. While it's certainly true that there are two ways to create economic value, do it through technological means, do it through fucking with perception. Here's my question. When you do it through technological means, you have a moat built in a way that you might not have in psychological means. How do you protect yourself against that?
No, absolutely fair. And I think, it's worth remembering there is trademark law. There's intellectual property protection.
Yeah, Sarah Blakely with Spanx or whatever.
It's interesting where I don't think Uber patented the map. Right. But the map caused Uber to grow to a point where it actually enjoyed network effects.
Okay, so you're saying speed of growth can create a first mover advantage.
That actually, in Austrian economics, that's called Schumpeterian rent. And it's the idea that the entrepreneur, even if he can't legally protect his idea, by establishing it first, enjoys a perceptual advantage over his competitors, in the same way that, in a way, right? Budweiser has a hugely valuable brand. It has a hugely valuable trademark, but it also enjoys, heritage. There are heritage advantages. There are advantages over Coca-Cola's massive advantage is the fact that because it was the first universally available carbonated drink, it's the only thing you can ask for confidently anywhere and not expect them to say no, apart from water, maybe. Apart from water, maybe. Okay, so you can go to a Tanzanian beach shack and you can go to a Michelin-starred restaurant in Paris, and you can say, I'd like this, and I like a Diet Coke. And if they say we don't have Coca-Cola, it's their fault, not yours.
Yeah.
If I ask for Dr. Pepper, right, monsieur, you are the absurd individual. Le Dr. Pepper in our fine establishment, right? Okay. Whereas Coke, they'd look like idiots if they didn't sell it. Now actually Whole Foods doesn't sell it, but that's because they're consciously being arseholes, really.
Yeah.
I personally think it's ridiculous.
Okay, so let me ask you this, Teach. Say Pepsi came to Ogilvy and they ask you, okay, we want to once and for all finally disrupt Coca-Cola. Is that even possible? Because Dave Trott, he always talks about brand leader and market cap and the different approaches you need to use.
They're the same people buying it, right? Okay. Yeah. So, I actually met I had a very close friend who applied for a job at Coke, and Coke are super weird about this. So this guy was saying to my friend, he said, it drives my daughters crazy because if we're in a restaurant and we've sat down and we've got a table and I order a Coke and they say, we only got Pepsi, I'm out of there, right? So this Coke guy who worked for Coke would actually walk out of a restaurant having booked and reserved a table because they serve Pepsi, not Coke, right? Now, okay, now nobody in the consumer space is really like that, okay? The drinks are substitutable. But there are a whole bunch of factors, one of which is that if you serve Pepsi, not Coke, one of which is that McDonald's had to, basically say to 10 million customers a day, when they got rid of Coke, they said, we have McDonald's Cola or we have Pepsi. Okay. And, that just makes them look slightly ridiculous. It also makes you look slightly cheap, to be honest. So there is a kind of establishment reputation question there. Well, we've only got Pepsi. Is that all right? Okay. And so there's all that stuff going on. It's really just a network effect. And you can, it's worth remembering, by the way, in different geographies, the network effect's different. So in
WhatsApp, iMessage.
Yeah, you got it exactly. So you've got in Latin America, WhatsApp was massive, wasn't it?
Yeah, Britain, in Europe as well.
Britain was a total mess because it was a complete equal divide between three places. And so some people used Messenger, some people used SMS, obviously, some people used WhatsApp, and we still haven't got a default consensus on which the default messaging app is. And that's partly because in the UK, texting SMS became free as part of your package very early on. In Latin America, it was a major expense. So when WhatsApp came in with the over-the-air texting service, it captured Latin America by storm, you see.
Same in Holland.
Yeah, interesting. Because in the UK, nobody would have, it's not even noticed now. It just goes unlimited texts. Picture messaging they charge for, but basic text messaging, or it's like 500 a month, in which case nobody other than the weirdo really hits their threshold, And so in Britain, the text wasn't really seen as a price sensitive entity because it was all part of your mobile package anyway.
No, the providers in Holland were super, super cheap. I used to work in a call center when I was young, and they used to instruct us with this also shows the disconnect between like management and like the people who are actually in the trenches. But they used to like give us like the sales script and whatever, and they tried to like really encourage us to use the following value proposition. Hey, we'll give you unlimited texting, and this was like years after you had WhatsApp and whatever, and everyone's like, okay, gee, thanks. It's almost insulting. You're trying to look cool and like be like we're giving you a gift, but you're not giving us a gift at all. You're only doing it because no one will take advantage of it. That's, by the way, that ties into your whole concept context of a gift, where it's like the context matters. You can't pay your life for sex, etc.
Exactly. Yeah.
So customers were almost insulted.
The Schumpeterian thing is if you're the first mover, and of course. The Austrian would describe the most successful innovation as the one that actually is a success in marketing terms, not the one that's a success in objective terms. And so because of that, they say the first person to crack this market, and cracking a market might be a combination of psychology, technology, or one or the other, okay, gets disproportionate gains through first mover advantage, network effects, fame. There's a simple chronological form of, and they call that Schumpeterian rent, which is the reward you get for being an entrepreneur by being first in a category.
Interesting. I actually read a paper on that, on first mover advantage. It was interesting. They the authors made a matrix in different types of markets, and the relationship that it had with first mover advantage and the importance of it. And in certain markets, a first mover advantage can be a very useful advantage, but in other markets, it's kind of like you have this no man's land, and you send someone out, and he's the probability of stepping on a landmine or whatever is like almost 1. So it's almost better to like wait and see a little bit, let someone step on a landmine, it explodes, and then you follow them. But that's in a very high risk market where like the product market fit is very complicated between technology and the market adoption.
No, and actually, in fairness, it's quite often second mover advantage, because the first person establishes the category, and then the second person gets all the attention.
Facebook wasn't the first. Google wasn't the first. Google was like search engine 12. Facebook was like social platform number 4 or 5 or whatever.
No. I mean, MySpace was, I mean, huge. News International paid something like, $1 billion or something for MySpace. And of course I don't know if they've actually turned it off. Maybe it still exists.
I believe I saw an article like 2 years ago or something that the founders might have bought it back, but I'm not 100% sure.
Good grief, that's interesting.
Something like that. Yeah. Interesting.
And of course, the problem with MySpace was probably the user experience, which is if you're a teenager with no aesthetic sense, right? It was great fun because it was like a scrapbook, but people over 25 didn't want a scrapbook, really.
Yeah. The most favorable hypothesis on why it failed was that Facebook didn't succeed. Facebook was the only viable alternative because MySpace just started sucking so bad. And the reason why is because they had a huge technical debt. So the website became very slow and almost to the point of being unusable, which is why users started to migrate because Facebook was so much easier.
I see. I didn't realize that. So actually there was partly
they shut themselves essentially.
Fascinating. Yeah, really, really interesting.
Yeah, let me ask you a question because we talked about Austrian economics, and Austrian economics relies heavily on deduction, whereas in advertising, we're in favor with direct response of a more empirical, inductive type of reasoning. So, like, how do we square those two?
Well, my great thing there is a real problem with inductive reasoning. Okay, it's really simple. Okay. And I put it very simply the other day on Twitter, which is there are far more good ideas that you can post-rationalize than there are good ideas that you can pre-rationalize.
Yeah.
And that actually applies to scientific discovery as well. Far more of them are actually made through accidents than by intention.
Yeah, the same is probably true for startups as well.
Because one of the great reasons I think to be in marketing rather than to be in academic behavioral science is that we perform accidental behavioral experiments all the time, which are paid for, right? Now, in academia, you've got to make a case for making the experiment before the experiment takes place, right?
Yeah, so it's more deductive in a sense.
Whereas what happens in business is you do something, you had no intention of finding out this thing, and you look at it and go, what the fuck is that? Right? Right,
That can be right.
Yeah. And so essentially, the whole obsession on, I always get deductive and inductive reasoning confused, but the whole obsession with that kind of sequential reasoning is, and in advertising agencies, I don't believe in process. I think the process is iterative and parallel. I don't think it's sequential. Because let me give you an example. It happened beautifully, actually, 3 days ago. So there was an approach which the planners were really interested in, but they rejected because they said the problem with this approach is it basically results in this dead end. Now, I used to be a copywriter for 15 years, and I know that actually the simple lesson of being a copywriter is changing the sentence very slightly can have a huge effect. And I said, no, you've got it wrong because, so the problem was, I think it was like Kent, which is my part of the UK, is known as the Garden of England, right? And it's a very valuable property because it emphasizes the place's beauty. And they wanted to emphasize the Garden of England because it's close to London, it's okay? And they said, the trouble is, if you say, where your business grows, right? All of the people who have businesses in Kent get in touch with the people doing the advertising and say, well, my business is doing fucking appallingly. Where the hell are you helping me? You're doing all these ads trying to encourage other competitors to move to Kent, right? And my business is in shit, right? And so we said, okay, we were basically writing off this avenue of attack. Yeah. And then it was a total kind of like, okay, how do you say this? And you're experimenting in your head. And you go, hold on, if you say grow your business here, right? I grow garden, right? That's the link. Okay. The link is the Garden of England growth. That's the basic sort of message you want to convey. If you make it the imperative and you say grow your garden here, grow your business here, okay, then actually the whole problem goes away.
Wow. You know what it reminds me of?
Yeah.
Dave Trotts' Docklands.
What was Dave Trotts? Oh, yeah. Hold on. You'll have to remind me about this. This is really fascinating, which was
the Docklands campaign. No one wanted to be in a Docklands, but they repositioned it as being like basically the cool place.
That's right. Yeah.
It went from uncool to cool.
And I mean, they did some real.
I can send you the campaign.
Funnily enough, there was another campaign for Docklands done by the guy Tony Brignall, who worked at Abbott Mead Vickers, and it's called "Are You a Knocker or a Docker?" And it basically had a list of thick knockers and dockers. And knockers were kind of people who were skeptical. You know, they thought Concorde should never have been built, which they're probably right, by the way. You know, they thought, you know, they were kind of people who weren't interested in this. You know, they were Luddites, basically. And so you had the knocker versus the docker. And there were just sort of like 30 things, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. And it was Tony Brignall did it. And that was an equally good campaign. Yeah.
That's interesting. Talking about Abbotts Agency, in your interview with what's his name, Chris, I believe, from 42 Courses, the story that you told about yours till the cows come home, Davy
Abbott. Yeah. What? Yeah. So they basically nicked a load of writing paper of Abbott Mead Vickers.
Oh, yeah.
And what's brilliant about that is, if you'd attempted to fake it, you would have got it. It would have worked, I think, but it would have got you into trouble. So they go, okay, how do we break the rules here? How do we basically cheat without cheating? And the way to do it is to do it in such a ridiculous way. So this is where humor basically breaks the rule. Can you steal writing paper from Abbott Mead Vickers and pretend to be David Abbott and thereby recommend people for interview, right? Well, the answer to that question in conventional logic is no. Because if you got found out, which you might be, right? Okay, you might get into trouble, and also it's an unethical way to do it. But it really was. It was written like in ridiculous handwriting. I think so. Davy Abbott actually had a smiley face in the tail of the Y, right?
And that's even funnier. That's even funnier if you know what he looks like.
And it's even no, because he was the most precise kind of. I mean, he was the wonderful thing was he was the complete opposite of the stereotype of a creative person. I mean, he was very, very conventional in his own personal life, actually. And the brilliant thing was, it was something like, you know, hi, Bill. These guys showed me their book, and I thought, fuck me. Unfortunately, I think he said, unfortunately, I haven't got any room at my gaff at the moment. So I thought you might be interested. And then it was their drum, which is like an East End slang for flat, right? What is it? Drum and bat or something? I don't know. It's like drum and bat flat. I mean, it's some rhyming slang thing, which David Abbott, you know. The idea of David Abbott saying, you know, I went home and the old trouble and strife is giving me a bit of, you know, I mean, you know, and so it was their drum is at like 020-745, you know, whatever. Yours till the cows come home, Davy Abbott, you know, and it was such a brilliant thing. Because and it was just, and that's what I mean about the opposite of a good idea, you know, that actually that and one of the most important things is humor as a creative device.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
In my essays, like right now, my work is like 50-50. Right now is 50% is like I'm trying to create this field and create the models and whatever and do something similar to BJ Fogg in my own field. And like the other half of my work is like more a little bit like loose and a little bit like riffing on ideas and just seeing, like thinking on paper essentially. But one of the things that I do and talk about a lot is like the scary mapping, the scary bijection between us in the entrepreneurial world and like stand-up comics. It's eerily similar. It's so crazy because you talked about menu stress, right? And you talked about like being in the airport and being nervous because you have a row of people and you feel their eyes piercing. A comic would look at that. Jerry Seinfeld always says, you live your life and you look for the funny in situations. And I feel like we're so close, but what we do is we look for the solution. So we see the same situation and we start thinking about it from an entrepreneurship perspective, like how can we address this? How can we solve this particular problem in a way that might even create economic resources, which, you know, you want to be profitable as a company. And a comedian looks at that very same situation and they're trying to find the funny. So it's so similar.
So the classic example is benign violation theory of humor, is the theory that it's like tickling or play fighting among lion cubs, okay, which is they have to set a context in which one lion can attack the other in play fighting without it being interpreted as a threat. Okay, because you need to practice fighting to be good at real fighting, but you don't want your practice to turn into a real fight. I mean, imagine if I went in an imaginary spar with a boxer and he just basically whacked me in the face, right? Okay, I would never, right? Okay, I would be, I'd probably be killed. Okay, right. So you have to set this environment where we're doing
I don't know.
this.
You see, I saw during your keynote. You're quite loose and nimble. I don't know.
Maybe. But what it is you're doing it, but you're not doing it for real. And so in a lot of humor, you're being rude, but you're not being rude. So I think it's two examples, actually. If you take David Abbott's Economist thing, which is, I never read The Economist, management trainee aged 42, okay? Well, there's a bit of knowing humor in that, because a lot of people wouldn't know that a management trainee aged 42 is a bit late to be getting going. And also, there are a lot of people, actually, it's a slightly nasty ad if you decode it, because there are a lot of people in life who'd be delighted to be put on a management training course at the age of 42, but not the kind of person who The Economist was trying to reach.
Yeah.
But if you said, basically, if you don't read The Economist, you're a loser, right? Yeah. We'd react to that appallingly. Yeah, okay, we go, fuck you, bunch of, basically, I haven't read The Economist. I run an extremely successful light engineering works in the way, right, okay, you just basically react to that with fuck you. Whereas if you say it funny, okay, you get away with it. And we absorb the message in a way that doesn't prompt an immune reaction, as it were.
Oh, that's so good. Jerry Seinfeld, in terms of comedy, he calls it like tap dancing and missing the laser beams.
So exactly that. It's exactly, and that's why the political correctness thing in comedy becomes really dubious. Because if you accept benign violation theory, there is going to be a bit of violation going on, right?
Yeah.
And so, if you take Jim Jeffries, Australian guy who's very big in the States now. And actually, it's interesting to see how many British and Australian people make it in American comedy now, because you can kind of go to places where an American couldn't quite.
Yeah.
And he talks about guns, and he goes, look, there's a perfectly good reason for the Second Amendment, okay? Guns are cool. I like guns, okay? Right? I get that. Don't take away my fucking guns. I get that argument.
That would be a good creative campaign.
Yeah, exactly. And guns are, guns are really fucking cool, right? Yeah. I mean, they are. Guns off, I have to say, if I were in the United States and I was invited to go out, in the desert and fire an AK-47 at oil drums, I'd really enjoy that, right?
True.
And so, but the thing is, you can go in and you can tap dancing between the laser beams is exactly the right description. Yeah. So you go far enough and, and absurd enough. And you might even argue that it's an evolutionary reward for being able to stray out of social constraints on thinking and speech.
Yeah. So
it could be, it's both two things. It makes it possible and but the fact that we enjoy laughing also means that it rewards you for doing it.
Interesting. If you look at Clay Christensen's framework of job to be done, the job of a comedian is essentially make people laugh. Like, that's it. Yeah, and if you have that as your objective, then all the other stuff, it will work itself out, because you need to write creative material in order to have enough material that you can go on stage, test it, whatever. What would you say is our job, like in entrepreneurship and creative? Is it? Now, I don't want to influence you. Just what's your take on that? Like,
the interesting thing is, it's a behavioral science challenge, because I've got to make people laugh, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the means by which I can deploy to achieve that end are various. It's hugely context dependent. So Jimmy Carr, I don't know if you know Jimmy Carr, he's an outlier because he wears a suit, which is really weird. Most comedians, it helps if you're kind of fat or scruffy or have some kind of, outsider status, rather like, the jester, or the dwarf or something, right? Yes. In medieval court society, you have this person, the jester, who is kind of licensed to say things that nobody else could say.
Yeah.
And so it is. But the interesting thing is, the one thing comedians do is they experiment a lot, and they experiment internally, and they also experiment with audiences. So Stuart Lee talks about this process where there was something where, he wanted Gary Lineker, who's a football commentator, okay, and he ended up with Like a Velvet Owl. But he said he'd been through about 10 iterations before he decided that Velvet Owl was funny. And Douglas Adams, who wrote the Hitchhiker's books, used to go and get P.G. Wodehouse books. And whenever he laughed particularly much at a paragraph, he'd spend like an hour reverse engineering what it was that made the sentence funny.
I do the same thing with copy. Gary Halbert taught me that. He said whenever something aligns with you, and from a Kahneman system 1 perspective, as a consumer you're triggered, tear it out of the magazine, or copy it into a Notion or Google Docs or whatever, and really try to reverse engineer like what happened there. Use your system 2 to see what happened in the system 1 perspective, essentially. Yeah. Because it's like what you said. There's a quote. It's attributed to Mark Twain, but he wasn't the one who said it first. But it doesn't matter. But it's like the difference between the right word is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug, or something like that. But like these tiny tweaks can have a huge impact.
Absolutely fantastic. Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, that's really useful. And I've noticed that time and time again. This is why I don't think you can have planning as a precursor to the creative process, because you need to have creative people going, I get where you're driving out there, but the trouble, and then someone can say, I don't think this route really works creatively because I don't know how to express it. And one person can say, but if you add the word probably, it does work. You have, and that's the lightning bolt thing. Just do it if you think about it, okay? Just do it was really a celebrity ad campaign where the real message they wanted to say was Michael Jordan did it using Nike, right?
Yes.
Now, if you say Michael Jordan did this with Nike, right? Okay, it's a totally useless message because it says, well, I'm not Michael fucking Jordan. What the hell what? If you turn that into, instead of Michael Jordan did it, you turn it into just do it, the whole meaning is completely transformed.
Let me ask you a question real quick. That first sentence, that first concept, Michael Jordan did it. Do we know ex ante? Do we know ex ante that it's not going to work, or should we still test it and see what happens because weird ideas can work and whatever? Or should you say okay, the probability is low, it's probably not worth testing? What's the right way to think about that?
I think the only thing you can do is you have to say, okay, there has to be a iterative thing or a parallel thing between the crafting of the message and the voicing of the message.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, the Nike campaign was a celebrity campaign, totally standard celebrity campaign. It basically said Michael Jordan did it wearing Nike.
Yeah, we've had those since when, the 20s or something?
19th century. I mean, they were often in the 19th century. Soap brands were actually advertised by aristocrats.
David Ogilvy actually said that he wasn't a fan of using celebrities. He had
he was wrong about that actually, but also he believed in celebrities if they had expertise in the area. So he said it was totally okay to use Lewis Hamilton to talk about motor oil. Okay, that was okay. What he wasn't in favor of was using Jimmy Carr to talk about motor oil.
Okay, yeah.
So he did accept celebrities, but he believed they should be conveying some sort of expertise or skin in the game. So actually, David Ogilvy wouldn't have opposed the Nike campaign because he said it was showing expert basketball players wearing Nike clothing.
Okay. Since we're on the topic of Ogilvy, do you have any thoughts on the New York School of Advertising versus Chicago School of Advertising? So Ogilvy and Leo Burnett and Bernbach and their different views. Have you any?
Yeah, the original home of advertising, which is Lord and Thomas with Albert Lasker, was Chicago, and that eventually turned into Foote, Cone and Belding.
Then. Am I wrong? I thought it was NWA Ayer and Son.
Yeah, sorry, NWA was the oldest agency. Okay. The real the real scale and explosion happened first in Chicago, I think, with Lord and Thomas.
I see.
Claude Hopkins, if I'm right, Claude Hopkins was paid $185,000 a year as a copywriter in 1920, right?
Whoa, what's that like now in this, like millions?
You'd have to say it's like 6 million. I mean, it's like $5 or $6 million a year. Yeah, I mean, it's almost impossible to. Yeah, and Lord and Thomas and David Ogilvy was always flattered that that Leo Burnett said that Ogilvy was the only New York agency
who
that
understood
Chicago.
School.
Yeah. And I think. I mean, what you had, I suppose, in New York was the burn back revolution. You had Ogilvy, etc. You had all those agencies, like a whole host of them, and that was where the creative revolution was considered to have taken place. But I think that was a relatively trivial creative revolution compared to the Chicago School revolution. And actually, I think Claude Hopkins, of course, wrote Scientific Advertising, which is a book still worth reading. It's worth remembering that J. Walter Thompson's Howard Luck Gossage was in San Francisco. J. Walter Thompson's guy, James Webb Young, he was, I think, at J. Walter Thompson Chicago rather than J. Walter Thompson New York, if I've got that right. And so actually Chicago really, and of course it's the spiritual home of packaged goods. That's why.
Yeah.
Because it's actually, you've got S.C. Johnson, all of those things, the packaged goods are really Chicago brands. Coke's Atlanta, but because it was the railhead, you see, it was the distribution center. So if you wanted to go national, because, I mean, essentially Route 66, if you think about it, goes from Chicago to LA. And you're going to say, well, you'd think America's main road would go from New York to LA, but that was too far to drive, effectively.
Yeah.
And so Chicago was effectively the kind of hub for distribution. And so brands that wanted to go national that were previously local went to Chicago for that network reason. And Chicago, I prefer I mean, put it this way, I'd move to Chicago, not New York, if I went and worked in the States. It's a much better city.
It's so interesting. This is one of the critiques that I have, because my background initially is more in the startup world. So the disruptive startups.
Well, actually, being a marketing guy with mathematical ability in a startup role is untapped territory. I think there's a huge amount of potential there.
Yeah, it used to make me very insecure because I felt like first I'm a dropout. I'm a high school dropout, but I feel like I dropped out on the right side.
Where did you drop out from? Which university?
Tilburg University. We don't really have famous universities.
Yeah, that's famous. I don't know. Sorry. Let me get this right. Tilburg is, I would consider, and I know about it through behavioral science, but in terms of the social sciences and psychology, I regard it as one of the best universities in Europe, alongside ETH. Is it ETH Zurich? Now I don't know many European. I know it's weird. There aren't many famous universities in continental Europe, but about 3 of the places, I think. Let me get this right. There's one in Sweden. I think it might be Göttingen in Sweden, but there's a Swedish one, there's a Swiss one, there's a Dutch one. Which, in terms of what's the other great one for the social sciences in Holland? There's Tilburg and there's
Eindhoven, perhaps. Eindhoven is more.
Yeah, that's right.
No, Delft. You're talking about Delft, probably.
Delft. That's right. Yeah, and I see interesting work from those places. So no. The other thing is, I'll tell you a lovely story. In Silicon Valley, there are a load of people who are gaming the Ivy League system. Okay. Yeah. Now, getting an Ivy League education costs $250,000, and what they worked out is the letter of admission is free. The degree costs $250,000. The letter of admission is worth 90% of the value of the degree.
So signal value. I'm a Harvard dropout. I'm a Stanford dropout.
So they actually go to Silicon Valley firms and they just walk in and they go, look, I can code this. I can do Python, Java, whatever. Oh, I could go to Harvard or Stanford, but I'd rather work for you.
Yes.
And people go, yeah, fucking fine. If you're bright enough to get into Harvard, there's nothing you're going to learn at Harvard that is more valuable than what you'll learn here. right?
Yeah. My own that's one of the reasons why I dropped out, because, like I said, I come from a background of professional athleticism with tricking, and tricking is very underground. It's kind of like it's starting to become a little bit more popular, and you see it in all the movies right now, all the blockbusters. But it's kind of like skateboarding in the 80s or whatever, you know. So the people, and there's also no money. So if you're doing it, and if you're serious, you're doing it for all the right reasons, because there's no economic incentive. Yeah, so when I went to university, and I was surrounded by people who just wanted, I always call it a job passport. So instead of a degree, it's a passport to a job. They were leaning back, not really paying attention. Even the professors weren't really motivated. So it was a very jarring experience. I was expecting people like you, people with an off the charts intrinsic motivation, super knowledgeable, you know, and like being at the feet of the master, learning.
And you just said now, here's another thing, right? If you're $200,000 in debt, you can't really take much of a risk, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, okay. Or you've got rich parents, in which case, you know, capitalism isn't doing the job of talent spotting nearly as assiduously as it should be, you know. And the interesting thing there is, right, okay, you could effectively, the fact that you're $250,000 in debt is a massive incentive to go into law or corporate finance. And once you go into those things, you're trapped, right? You're never going to get out.
Yeah. Right? Peter Thiel made that argument.
Now, actually, if you don't have a degree, you could actually wander off to now. You know, in order to validate a $250,000 investment in your education, you got to go to Silicon Valley, or you got to go to New York, right? Right. Actually, maybe the real opportunity, which you can do if you didn't spend all that money and time getting a degree, is you go to Austin, Texas, and kick around there. Because actually opportunity may be far greater if you're exploring the informal route rather than the formal route.
This is your point that you made at the very beginning of this call again. You know, you're discounting, you're not properly taking into account the opportunity cost. You're not considering what
the opportunity cost is invisible, because you've got 3 years, okay, where you could more or less live for free, because that's what it would cost you to live at university anyway, right? Where you could be saying, okay, Facebook has a formalized, maybe you hang out in a bar where loads of people from Facebook work, right? I mean, that might be more valuable.
That's very similar. It's very similar to what I'm doing, because I basically said, okay, well, screw it. I'll do it the same way that I did it with tricking. I'll create my own education. So I started studying your work. I started studying Bill Bernbach, Dave Trotts, like everyone. Plus, on top of that, I went a step further, and I started like actually building relationships. So talking to people on Twitter and DMing and whatnot, and that's hugely more valuable.
I'll tell you why the UK education system will survive, actually, which is really interesting, which is learning fluent English is kind of worth $30,000. Okay. So spending 3 years in an English speaking country with English speaking people, okay, is actually more valuable than the education you get. Because this is, I'll tell you a very interesting complexity theory thing, right, which you'll like. Okay. So people, and I always regard that as evidence of people who want to pretend to be intelligent while actually being stupid. People say the British, okay, the British are really bad at learning foreign languages, right? Now, actually, okay, that's obviously nothing to do with the education system or anything like that, because the Irish are really bad at learning foreign languages. Now, let me explain this, okay, right? So let's imagine you're Dutch, right? Okay, well, first of all, the question is, do I need to learn a foreign language? Now, if you only speak Dutch, the answer is yes, right? Okay, there's not, because you go, look, as soon as I leave Holland and northern Belgium, I won't be able to communicate. I won't even be able to read the road signs if I don't speak a foreign language. Second question is, which language do I learn? And that's a really easy question, because
English.
You learn English first, okay? And that's not because it's the most spoken, it's because it's the most widespread, okay? So English is going to be useful to you in business. It's going to be useful to you in politics, okay, or anything else, but it's going to be useful to you pretty much anywhere in the world. So if you ended up in Latin America, you would have been better off learning Spanish, but English is still reasonably useful. Whereas if you'd learned Arabic and you ended up in South America, you've wasted 2 years of your life, right? And then you get the third one, which is I've got to learn a language bit by bit. Now, if you're Dutch, you get English language TV. That helps a bit, right? You can speak to your friends in English because they're also learning English. So if you want to get a bit of practice in, you can chat in English to your Dutch friends, right? I don't have any English friends who are learning Dutch, right? Okay. There are very few Dutch language subtitle programs on British TV. I mean, I've probably only watched about 3. Okay. Swedish, funnily enough, because of their crime dramas, we get quite a bit of that. But but then, okay, when you go, every word of English you learn makes English more valuable to you. Right now, if I went to Holland, I'd have to live in Holland for a year before my Dutch. Well, no, I'd have to live there for 3 years before my Dutch was better than your English, or as good as your English, right? Okay, so for the first 3 years,
I'm still working on your accent.
So for the first 3 years I'm living in Holland, this is a further disincentive. For the first 3 years I'm living in Holland, everybody's going to speak to me in English anyway, right? Because they're better at speaking English than I am at speaking Dutch. So there's a long period where there's zero return on language learning.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, okay, if I marry a Dutch girl and I move to Holland, and I know I'm going to be living in Holland for 5 years, at that point, okay, the investment pays off. But to a Dutch person, learning English pays off day one, and it's a really easy decision.
Yeah. So what you're saying
I still can't decide. You know, I sometimes think, gosh, I'd quite like to learn a language. And as an English speaker, it's really bloody difficult as a decision, because a bit of me wants to learn Italian because it sounds great, right?
Yeah.
You know, Italian sounds, not many people speak it, but it does sound fantastic. And it would be quite nice to be able to speak Italian, just because Italy's, you might go there on holiday or something. Okay. And then, some of me wants to learn Spanish, but then the problem would be, well, that's probably the most obvious second choice. But it's not obvious, because in anywhere outside Latin America and the Iberian Peninsula, and actually even in Portugal or Brazil, right, Spanish is kind of useless, right?
Yeah.
So suddenly, and you get into this problem where it's very difficult as a Brit to say I'm going to learn a language, because you can't even decide which one to learn.
Yeah, the incentive structure is completely asymmetrical.
Totally asymmetrical. Yeah.
Super fascinating.
And so I always say, when someone says the English are terrible at learning foreign languages, I think it's a disgrace. I always go, you haven't really thought about this, have you? You're just basically expressing an opinion.
That's how I feel when people say the thinly veiled insult of those who can do, those who can't teach.
Yeah.
That's always how. By that logic, we should all take our advice on nutrition and health from Instagram models.
I know. It's one of those things, isn't it? Which is just, it's one of those phrases which is just, it's
sticky.
It's just a sticky phrase. And teaching, by the way, which I did for a bit, is bloody difficult.
Yeah. Oh, that's so true.
To do it well, I mean, one of the reasons I didn't become a teacher is I thought, actually, this would be quite a nice life if you did it badly. But I don't want to spend 30 years of my life doing something badly. If you want to do this well, it's really bloody tiring. It's really, really effortful.
By the way,
so I'll give you an example. Okay, if I have a day where I give 2 presentations over Zoom, I really dread that day. Okay. I go, oh God, I got a presentation in the morning and a seminar in the afternoon, and I'm hosting both of them. I kind of go, oh fucking hell, 2 in a day.
Wow. I thought it was easy. It seems so effortless.
It's funny. It isn't. It's really, really weird, and I don't quite understand why.
By the way, if you have to run, then
I do have to go. It's 2:01, so I do have to go in a couple of minutes. But
I don't want to keep you.
But let me have a think. Let's catch up again. And I would say that pursuing tech companies and saying, look, I'm a mathematician who does behavioral science, is actually quite an interesting way to go.
Interesting.
I mean, try it. And the other thing is, if you ever want to work for us, which is by no means impossible. We're just obviously in COVID, we're not hiring anybody. We're growing, but WPP doesn't really know how to grow organically, to be honest. It doesn't really have a mechanism for it. And so it's much easier for WPP to buy a company than it is to grow one itself.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing there is that, but I mean, my point about the degree, I've said this about mathematicians. Someone came to me who couldn't get any job interviews because they got a 3rd in maths from Cambridge, right? And I said, look, I said, mate, I said, if you could get into Cambridge to do maths, right? First of all, I haven't come across anything in my work that a third-class mathematician from Cambridge couldn't solve, but a first-class mathematician could. I'm sure there are things, but I've never come across one in my entire 30 years of my career. Secondly, if you did come across that, the fact that you went to Cambridge to do maths means you presumably know a load of people who got first-class degrees in maths from Cambridge, and you could ring one of them up and ask them to help, right?
Yeah. That's how it works in the real world. You're allowed to cheat in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to put a cash value on learning fluent English. And therefore, I would argue that every single British university is an American university, but they're much more expensive. If I were Ireland, I'd make a fortune out of this, because essentially your university is a language school plus a university. Now, it used to happen, you won't believe this, okay? I had a friend who went to Manchester Business School in the late 1980s. And there are a load of Japanese students there, and they all passed, okay? And none of them put in very much work. They're pretty. Now, this is really weird. You're going, the Japanese are lazy. What the hell's going on here? I've thought many things about the Japanese. I've never thought lazy bastards, right? Okay. But they generally didn't work very hard. And this guy said, what's actually going on here? Because you're not really taking the MBA course as seriously as we are. Yeah. And they basically explained they're sent there by their company for two reasons. And bear in mind, this was the late 80s, before the Japanese crash, okay? One of them was to learn English, because by living in Manchester for 3 years, they become fluent in English, right? Or reasonably fluent in English, and by being taught in English and everything else.
Yeah.
The third reason was to get a business qualification and to learn more about business. The second reason they were being sent there, to learn to play golf, because at the time golf courses in Japan were so expensive. If you wanted, now golf was essential to your progress in Japanese business, because Japanese business in 1988 took place on the golf course. It was a totally male, totally patriarchal thing, and if you wanted to do a deal with someone, you went and played golf, right? And it was really expensive to learn how to play golf, because golf club membership would cost something like 200,000 euros. So it was cheaper to send them to Manchester Business School and get them to join a Manchester golf club, right, than it was to get them to learn in Japan.
Wow.
And so the order was learn English, learn golf, learn business.
Oh, that's too good. Yeah, I got one more question, but I don't want to keep you if you have to run right now.
I can give it 2 more minutes, no problem. Ask away.
Okay. What are your thoughts on lead acquisition if you're early stage like me?
Really interesting.
Because I'm figuring out my positioning and whatnot. I have a few people that really like my work, the so-called true fans. But right now I'm figuring out all of the positioning stuff and
your mathematical ability combined with your behavioral science and psychology ability. I would say if you can find a really good data science AI company, because my argument is that data science without behavioral science is actually a bit of a dead end, because you're understanding what people are doing without any explanatory power over why they're doing it. And so there might be a really good niche, admittedly it'd be a paid job, not a business, but there might be a really interesting way, before you start your business, spend 3 years in a data science company, combining the two, and then you've got the basis for a fantastic business.
Interesting.
So, if you really love maths, it was the university you didn't like, not the maths, right?
Yeah, that's true. I still do math. Although I am more focused on like pure mathematics, which is it's different than applied mathematics. It's basically like, if it's useful, then we don't do it.
You don't do it. No.
Yeah, exactly. Number theory, group theory, stuff like that.
Yeah, got it. It's all you. It's philosophy at that level, isn't it? Really. But I mean, if you've got a good statistical grasp, and you can do the kind of the regression-y stuff and all that stuff. Okay. Presumably, if you can do the pure maths, you can do that stuff standing on your head, I would guess.
Yeah. Right now, most of my work is focused on helping. My work centers around like how to design a better company. So a lot of my work revolves around helping founders or people who run a company create a better company through the things like behavior designs and creative solutions, behavioral economics and whatnot. So mathematics is quite light, although I use it sometimes as a metaphor.
Before you start your own business, I do 3 years in paid employment in some role which allows you to combine the two.
Interesting.
And then from there, there's a great thing about maths as a measure of ability, by the way. I noticed this at university because my brother was at the same university as me, and he was a mathematician and astrophysicist, and we hung out with a lot of mathematicians. And the interesting thing, there's a wonderful story about Ramanujan. You've probably come across this Indian mathematician who wrote to G.H. Hardy, right? Now, G.H. Hardy used to get like a load of letters from people with weird theories, and he'd generally go, "Oh God, it's a nutter," right?
Yeah.
But he had one advantage. He said, ultimately, he said, it's harder to fake being a great mathematician than it is to be one. Now, in most disciplines, it's easier to fake it than it is to do it, right?
Yeah.
But in mathematics, I had a guy, I love this guy. I kept Googling him. I wonder what happened to him. Totally working class guy, but a maths prodigy at Cambridge. And he arrived. His dad was a lorry driver, so when he arrived, the lorry drove into the college and he offloaded his trunk from the back of the lorry because his dad was a lorry driver, right? And genuinely working class background, you know. And the Cambridge maths tripos is 2 days in a row, morning after 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon, 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon. It's pretty hardcore. 2 days, 6 hours of maths every day. He used to come back at lunchtime and have a couple of pints. And even my brother, who is pretty naturally talented mathematician, my brother said, "Hold on, but you've got an exam this afternoon and you're drinking beer?" And he go, "Yeah, it helps me relax."
Wow.
What the fuck, right?
Yeah.
And he got a double first, you start first, everything else. Because he just found it really easy.
Oh, interesting.
You know, and I've always been in awe of mathematicians for that, because it's something you can't fake. You know, you've either got it or you haven't, basically. And my brother was kind of going, "But you got an exam, you know, was it Kevin Atkins? You got an exam in the afternoon, you're drinking beer." He goes, yeah, it just relaxes me. And he'd just go in and there'd be some set theory question. He'd be there after a pint, you know, just scribbling away. I mean, I was just, okay,
I do feel that most people think mathematics is much harder than it actually is. It is hard, but most of the hardness is an artifact of that is that just the teaching is so bad. We do such a poor job of explaining it. Well, because if you explain it very clearly and you're able to get like that aha moment in someone's brain, it all becomes super obvious.
It'd be really interesting if my brother and I ever got together to write a maths textbook which teaches you you're absolutely right. Because the other thing I've always wondered, I never know about
look at YouTube right now. You have all of these people who are studying mathematics, and while they're studying, they're creating content. They don't have the time constraints that a professor has, so they can really do their best on creating very good content and very good 3D objects and whatnot in a video. And you just see the appetite. These channels have millions of subscribers. They make it very easy to understand, because in a book, you know, you have these pictures and like the whole textbook industry is a scam. The books aren't even good, and
no, they are terrible. I agree.
Yeah,
I agree. This is really interesting, because I always wonder about this, which is I'm no good at chess. My brother, actually, who you might expect as a kind of maths nerd to be good at chess, isn't any good at chess. And to be honest, I always wonder, is it because we're not interested, or is it because we're no good?
Yeah, I 100%
I've always
think
wondered,
it's the interest part.
I think it is, because I don't want to be the kind of person who's a good chess player for some reason.
You need to read Chamberlain. I believe his name is Chamberlain. Chamberlain's paper on the extraordinary tediousness of success, or something like that. It's a paper from the 60s. Have you read it?
No, I haven't. I'd love to read that. Yeah.
He wanted to study success, and he needed to find a way to control all the independent variables. So he studied swimmers, Olympic swimmers, and basically his conclusion was like, there is no talent. Talent is this vague concept that we use to hide behind, but it's more about conscientiousness and developing good practices and good systems and focusing on that. which is it's very interesting.
Daniel Kahneman said that wanting to be a great actor or a great sportsman is the worst thing you can do for your happiness, because you'll almost certainly fail. Okay, because Scott Adams, have you read Scott Adams on his thing about being good at two related things?
Yeah, you said that as well in a video.
Yeah, no, I came to the conclusion, I didn't realize Scott Adams had said this, and I always feel a bit of a plagiarist, but I came up with it totally independently, which is at the intersection of two things, you can find things out that nobody else is doing. Whereas if you, unless you're incredibly lucky, there's only room for about 20 great tennis players at any one time, you know. I mean, once you get down to like number 207 in the world, these guys are living out of their cars, right? Okay. Yeah. All the gains go to the very top. And so Scott Adams' thing is absolutely right. I think it's really, really interesting.
April Dunford makes this exact point in positioning for companies. She's like, you know, really dial in on who the audience is and the exact value proposition. And then you have the intersection in a Venn diagram that's super unique. So then you're competing against like this big person and they do like a CRM or whatever. And it's a general purpose. It's for everyone. But you're like, yeah, but we specialize in investment banks. So they can't, that's good if you want to be like everyone. But if you want something that's unique for you,
because actually, and also it actually means if you're good at two things, you can reweight depending on how circumstances change. So I sort of parlayed an interest in technology and direct marketing into an interest in the internet. And then I parlayed an interest in the internet and technology and direct marketing into an interest in behavioral science. Okay. And so you can effectively evolve two skills into a third skill, but you can't evolve one skill into another, into a second. And so, yeah, it's really, I'm sorry, I better dash now because it's nearly 1:15, but it's a really, really interesting thing. It's a fascinating point. I'll look up that Chamberlain paper. If you could email me, The Extraordinary Tediousness of Success. I'd be really grateful.
Do you prefer email or Twitter DM?
Either, whichever you prefer. Either's fine. Right. I use both. What a pleasure.
Thanks
stay in touch. Whatever you do, stay in touch. It'll be fantastic. Thanks ever so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Whoop. What are we doing here?